All right, today we are going to start our DBA review for our final exam. This will be the last 2 weeks that we're going to have any assignment responsibility. There won't be any assignments that you'll be responsible for after April 30th, which is not this coming Friday, but the following Friday. All next week will be simply coming to take your DBA. All next week will be DBA. In April, when we meet for class, we're going to be doing some Minecraft field trip stuff and some cool Minecraft stuff, but we won't have any graded assignments after April 30th. And the last thing you'll have to do for next week will be to come and take your very final DBA. The DBA review is broken up into two parts. We're going to talk about four of the artists today. We'll talk about four more of the artists at our second meeting this week. And then next week, again, you'll have time to come in and take your last discussion based assessment that entire week next week and get everything wrapped up. So, what will you need to know about each of these artists? Well, again, there's a little synopsis at the end of each one, and we're going to talk about that as we get to the end of each artist we talk about. But you should know a little bit about what they've done. You should easily be able to identify which artist did which works of art. You should understand how they created art, how they used the elements of principles. You should know about whatever major contribution they made to the world of art or art history. Um, and when they worked. You want to know a little bit about the time frame in which they worked. The first artist we're going to talk about today is Henri Matisse. He was a French-born painter. Um, Again, he was born now in 1869. He would be 152 years old, 151 years old right now. I only know that because I'm 51 and I was born in 1969. So he would be 151 if he were alive today. And it's important to know that he was born in 1869, only so you can understand that it was those early 1900s, late 1800s, when he really did the bulk of his work from his 20s to about his 50s. So from roughly 1889 through the 1840s and there, and you can see he passed away in the mid 50s there. He was a Fauvist, and those Fauvists were those wild artists, those wild beasts they called them. They used those bright, crazy colors. You'll remember that, like a lot of other artists before him and after, it was illness at a young age that kind of led to him getting a lot of art supplies and being inspired to begin to create art. That Fauvist movement began in the 20th century, that early 1900s, when a group of artists, including Henri Matisse and Andre Derain, uh, um, began using those bright colors and they say unexpected ways. But we see these abstracted colors, lots of bright reds, yellows, blues, and greens, primary and secondary colors. Remember, that's how he uses color, primary and secondary. We should remember that those Fauvists used those broad, bold paint strokes. They were very painterly, we call it, because you could see the individual brush strokes. So when we think about how they use the elements and principles of art, they use a lot of pattern. If you'll notice the water in the yellow water created by the little pattern of the yellow blotches in that white space. Same with the blue next to it. So pattern, bold colors, that broad use of those brush strokes. Here we're looking at some of those very bright colors. Again, we're looking at the abstraction of color. The trees aren't green, they're kind of purpley blue. The little bushes are these teal colors and bright yellow colors, probably not very representational. And we see those bright red mountains kind of off in the background. That cat is a bright yellow. All of the colors you see there are primary and secondary. All the yellows, blues, and oranges, and reds, and a little bit of green, not even purple. Got about a five-color scheme there. In his later years, remember, he developed those health issues, and instead of kind of giving in, he changed and developed a new way of art. He started creating these really cool collages. He started working with cut paper and began to cut out these awesome collages. And as he did so, he creates, he still uses the abstracted color, but now we see lots of organic shape being emphasized, lots of um, sort of simplified shape, and that sort of abstraction coming in. Still the use of pattern. If we look at the leaves there, both in that green on the bottom left, there's the yellow leaves. In that top left, their image, and even sort of a pattern created there with those green and white stripes and that purple in the middle piece. Of course, that blue background with the yellow stars is sort of a pattern in of itself there. So, what should you know about Henri Matisse? He was a French painter, painted from the late 1800s through the early to mid 1900s. He was a father of Fauvism. You should be able to describe what those Fauvists were worked, how they worked those broad colors and bold, broad brush strokes and abstracted bold colors. Um, they were those wild beasts. He worked in collage later in his life. You should know that he focused on primary and secondary colors. Again, the brush strokes, the organic shapes, lots of pattern. You want to mention all those types of things. Andy Warhol was the second artist, or the second one we're going to talk about anyway. He was a pop artist, and you should know that stands for popular. Pop art focused on what was popular at the time. Andy started off as an illustrator, a graphic designer, and so we'll see some of that influence of graphic design and illustration as it makes its way into his works. He liked to listen to radio, read a lot of comic books, and we'll see some of that comic book imagery um, kind of translated into his works. Again, you should want to know when he worked. Um, we're talking really the 50s. We'll just say the 50s, 60s, 70s. Um, he passed away in 87, but really those last 10 years, we don't see a lot of. It was really the 50s, the 60s, and then the early 70s when we see his work. That pop art, again, is art that reflected what was in popular culture at the time. We've heard of pop culture, pop art. It's those things that were popular. We can think of iconic symbols. This is, um, oh goodness, from Breakfast at Tiffany's. Well, I'm stumped for the young lady, Audrey Hepburn, excuse me. And Marilyn Monroe was a big focus of some of his work, but he would focus on people who were in the mainstream, who were well known, or who reflected a broader understanding of something political. Or something that the world would recognize, something popular. And he would use those icons in his work. He used also pattern. If we look at that red, yellow, blue, and green in the background, we see those patterns being used. Simplified color, primary and secondary colors. Again, the repeated image over and over again creates that pattern, but also creates unity. As we look at these 6 images of Mao at the top, you'll see that while the colors change the image, because it essentially stays the same, it creates this repetition and this pattern. If you look in the bottom right hand corner, even though the animals are different behind Andy, it sort of creates that pattern that he was known for. Here we see the Mickey Mouse. Here we see the Campbell soup cans. When he became very successful, he opened a large studio called the Factory. You don't need to know so much about that or even the printmaking process. But what I'd like for you to know is this about this cooperative or collaborative process that he developed with um, uh, Jean Michel Basquiat, who you see him with here on the right hand side. And the image behind them is a large mural that the two did together. And you can sort of see influences of a little bit of both of them, but that's really a very Basquiat esque work. This is probably one of the more representative of the two, that Arm& Hammer logo that Andy creates in the back, representative of that iconic imagery that Andy would use with this very cool sort of text-based artwork that Jean Michel would have put over top of what Andy created. So, what did you know about Andy? You should know that he was worked during the mid to late 1900s, from the 50s through the 70s, as a major artist in the pop art movement. Pop art focused on what was popular at the time. His art focused on celebrity, name brands, and familiar images. He often used screen printing. You should know that he used bright colors and simple shapes. He created pattern by repeating those images. And he's also known for his collaborations with Jean Michel Basquiat. Those are the things that you'll want to know to be able to talk about for your DBA. Next up is Andy Goldsworthy. Andy Goldsworthy was that cool artist who only used the cool things that he found in nature, sand, ice, stone, wood, all that kind of stuff. He was born in 1956. That kind of lets us know that he's working through sort of the late 70s, mid late 70s, up until the 90s, late 90s, really, is when we see a lot of Goldsworthy work. Um, his nature began at an early age. His parents encouraged him to work on a farm, but he had a lot opportunity to go out and experience the woods in and around England. So we're going to look at sort of what he creates here. He uses again a lot of pattern, organic shape very often because he used organic media, and we look at the leaves, the rocks, the stones, the trees. This halo, this yellow, is really just created by bright yellow leaves. It looks like there's light coming out from under that tree. That's all created by the natural environment or elements of the natural environment that he's assembled and arranged to create these effects. He only used natural materials found in and around the areas that he worked. One of the cool things he would do is often arrange leaves in cool ways. These are floating on a some type of water thing here. It looks like, or at least the surface is wet, so you get that reflection going on in the background. It's really neat. Um, but he would even assemble leaves and put them in a stream. And the idea not being so much that he was making permanent works of art. In fact, the photographs that we're looking at are how his art was represented. The work he would make would be easily destroyed by nature in a short amount of time. So it's those photo images that were the lasting impressions we're generally left with. This is a stone wall he built. Obviously, this would be here a lot longer, but you can see this was not the type of typical stone wall that you would find in Kentucky. I mean, well, the medium is the same, but the structure is much different. Ours don't wind around in this cool S pattern like a snake. He's creating movement. That's how he's using this element of art line to create this principle of movement. Element and principle of movement. When we look at the verticals here, kind of created that kind of work as a juxtaposition to these cool curves, these essy things. It's pretty neat. And then anytime you work with water, you get a reflection that kind of repeats that image and makes that cool sort of pattern almost as you get that repeated image. Again, he's sort of working with pattern a little bit here as he creates those images over and over again. Often called an environmentalist. These types of artists use those natural materials not just to create something cool, but also to call attention to that space and to to that medium, and very often to the need to respect the nature that they've come from. This is a really cool sort of egg shape. This sort of oval egg is really neat. This is very reminiscent of some of the foundries we have here in Kentucky. We talked a little bit about that. What should you know about Andy? Andy worked in the mid to late 1900s. He worked exclusively with natural media, things only found in nature. He made geometric shape form and forms out of that organic media. Very often, he would create spheres and circles and otherwise geometric shapes out of those organic things. Often called environmental naturalists, those artists that work with those natural media to bring attention to nature and to the environment. We call those environmental naturalists. His work brought attention to the beauty and importance of nature. Last one we're going to talk about today is Faith
Things you need to
Ringgold.
know about them are Faith Ringgold.
Oh, I forgot there was narration on Faith. Let's see if we can take that out. Faith Ringgold's American artist was born on October 8th, 1930 in Harlem, New York. From a young age, she was surrounded by creativity. Her mom was a fashion designer, and so that's kind of where probably she got the instinct to use fabric a little bit. We did learn that she traveled to Asia while there. Looked at, I believe it's Asia, African Asia, and looked at the Tonka, those storytelling blankets and narrative quilts that then she begins to bring into her work. She was brought up during the Harlem Renaissance. That was an era of art, music, and storytelling. We look at the writing from that era, the music, the dance that was created during this era, and of course the visual arts, all part of that Harlem Renaissance, where we see this burgeoning art scene in that otherwise area that had been relatively devoid of art up until that period.
Stella.
Oh,
I had
uh, well, she had something she's trying to say. This is one of the quotes from her. Here's one of the things that I like about her is when we look at the work of Faith Ringgold, everything she does is an expression of her life in some way that she's trying to communicate her experiences to the viewer.
quilts.
Well, she often included texts and portraits of African American women to share her perspective of what was going on in her community. During that time, of course, African American women in particular, and more specifically artists, weren't being treated fairly. Even as the Harlem Renaissance was coming about, the men were taking a lot of the thunder, if you will, and so she was one of those artists who, um, you know, tried to steal a little of that thunder back, if you will.
Quilts.
Well, she was influenced by the Harlem Renaissance after World War II. Many African Americans chose Harlem as their new home. This shifted that type of art and music created there. And this is one of the works where she's expressing what she saw going on in and around her life. Those bright colors she used again, those primary and secondary colors. We see this abstracted look, simple, what we call simplified or simplification is part of abstraction, and that's what she's doing here. She's simplifying the shapes of the face, of the body, of the colors. If you look at the drum set, those are simple sort of circles and ovals that create the drums. And so she's not looking for realism. It's abstracted. What she's trying to create is that impression of that excitement or that energy in that moment.
Color.
When we look at how she used color, uh, we often see that use of color being very expressive for her. We saw those bright colors expressing the happiness and joy, but we also see that she's bringing attention to something. She was one of these who painted about the rights of women and of African Americans, and she focused on in this image, for instance, this is sort of a dark and sort of an ominous type of painting. She's not using those bright colors. These are obviously men in suits, probably representing that that male-dominated society. And these appear to be white men, so you get that impression of that how difficult it was to be brought up as an African American and female in this society that she grew up in, and so she sees this as part of that repression. That's why it's dark, not bright and colorful. When we look
Ringgold
at
often
pieces
included
like this, we look at pieces like this. We're looking at some of those early pieces she did. Again, those very simplified color. Um, this was sort of one of those introductive pieces that kind of takes us into that area where she starts doing some more of that um, um, those quilts. So I cut that off because we should be talking about the Tonka. We're not going to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright today. We're going to stop here. But you should know that Faith did a lot of those story quilts where she told about her personal story. She fought for the rights of African American and particularly women. Um, Focused on her art. She was brought up during the Harlem Renaissance. You should recognize when she worked, where she worked, and a little bit about how she used those elements, that and pattern as someone who creates quilts. If you've ever seen quilts, there's inherently pattern. When we made our Faith Ringgold pieces, you remember you put the pattern around the outside. All right, I'm going to remind you of the second part of the assignment for next week. We're going to take our DBA. You're also going to turn in one last piece of art. And that piece of art is going to be based on any of the artists we have studied all year. You're going to do one piece of art when we do our DBA. You'll bring it with you. We'll do a little critique. We'll talk about it. What you like about it, what you didn't like about it, and that sort of thing. We'll also talk at that final DBA about each and every artist in the review. So you need an attendance question answer to prove that you watched the first half. There'll be a second answer at the end of the second half. So the attendance answer for today, is everybody ready? Is, oh no, it's not pulling up. Oh no. Oh no. All right. Well, Claude Monet, sorry, I can't, it's all locked up. Claude Monet. Claude Monet. Claude Monet. Let me put it on here for you. I'm going to put it on here for you. Oh, not Claude Money. That would be great. All right. All right. Attendance answer for part one is Claude Monet. Sorry, I can't get that to pull up. I had a nice picture of him, too. He's got a really neat beard. Cool looking fella, but you won't get to see it today. So sorry. Attendance answer for part one, Claude Monet. Guys, I look forward to seeing you on our second day this week. We'll finish up with the last four artists, and then next week we'll meet for our DBA and take a look at the last piece of art that you created. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great day.